Enslaved people engaged in a variety of resistance tactics. Much of their resistance was intended to ameliorate the daily conditions of their bondage. So people might pilfer food from the garden or from their master's kitchen to supplement their own meager diets. People might feign illness or work at a slower pace than was demanded by their master, again, to give their bodies and their souls a time to rest and recuperate from the grueling pace of labor on most plantations. Enslaved people also gathered at night, right? They came together to pray, to socialize. Young people would come together to court each other, right? Effectively to date and to socialize. And so all of these kinds of behaviors we can think of as resistance because they violated slaveholders' demands about labor patterns. They violated slaveholders' wishes about food rations. They violated slaveholders' efforts to control the use of space. Slaveholders, southern communities, counties, and states passed legislation restricting enslaved people's gatherings, right? Decreeing that enslaved people could not gather on their own without a free white person monitoring them. And yet enslaved people did gather on their own, under the cover of night, in the woods, in secret locations. And they gathered for their own purposes, whether they were religious or social. But they gathered to affirm their humanity with each other, to foster and sustain emotional and social relationships with each other.
In terms of running away, it's actually more common for that to be temporary, just running away for a few hours to visit a spouse on another plantation. Running away for a few days is kind of a way to protest against labor conditions if you're unhappy about something. But in general, most runaways ultimately came back voluntarily, but they often did it as a way to kind of negotiate with their masters, kind of showing that I can run away whenever I want. If you don't let me visit my wife more, if you don't let me labor alongside of my children, I'm going to do this again. So it was kind of this way of resisting and negotiating with the masters.
Masters would use runaway slave ads to recover their slaves who have decided to leave the plantations or leave their houses, leave their service. In the ads, a master would list what the slave looked like. So they might mention certain physical features. Many people who are coming directly from Africa have what are known as country marks. And so they might list those country marks that a person has. They will speak about or write about what whether that person knows English or not. Do they know a little bit of English, a lot of English, no English at all? These ads would also mention how the person might have ran away, where they might have run away to, who they ran away with. So often you have groups of people running away, and in some interesting situations you actually have white servants running away with African slaves. You also have certain instances where you have a slave and a free person of color running away. So that might be mentioned. And of course, in any runaway slave ad, you're going to have a reward. These people are worth money, and in order to encourage people to recover them, you have to offer money to get them back.
Of course, slave rebellion is the kind of the ultimate form of resistance. But in general, that doesn't happen very frequently. There's a handful of large-scale rebellions in North America. But for the most part, it seems that slaves realize that they simply wouldn't be successful. They know that the whites, even though there may be less of them in some places on particular plantation regions, they have the guns, they have the power of the law to back them up. And so kind of resisting in violent means is often suicidal, and they're aware of that. Slave owners are very aware that slavery is dangerous. They know that their property has the potential to kill them, and they take precautions against that. They have slave patrols at night, so they see any black person walking on the road, they're supposed to stop them and question them, make sure they have a pass from their owner saying they have permission to be out. And of course, there's all sorts of brutal punishments, whippings, things like that, intended to terrify other slaves into obedience. And it's not just the power of the slaveholders, they have the power of the state and the law to back them up. If slaves if they openly resist, if they fight back when they're being whipped, it's not just the slaveholder will whip them more, he can then turn them over to the state who will execute them for striking a white person, for example.
One of the most striking and dramatic slave rebellions in the 18th century is the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina in September 1739. In this rebellion, a group of West African men who were brought from the West African coast to South Carolina, drew on their military training to organize a rebellion against South Carolina's slaveholders. They organized and planned their rebellion with a keen understanding of local political and social conditions. That is, they organized their rebellion to take place just before a South Carolina law that would require white men to carry guns to church went into effect. The South Carolina rebels, led by a man named Jemmy, aimed to get to Georgia and then to Florida. They hoped to get to Florida because Florida was a Spanish colony, and the Spanish had offered freedom to any enslaved person coming from a British colony and arriving in the Spanish colony of Florida. So they had a very keen understanding of the political terrain in which they were operating. Right? These rebels knew that they had to get to Florida in order to secure their full liberation from slavery. They knew, for example, that the Spanish colonial government was eager to destabilize the British colonies, and that the Spanish colonial government knew that one way to strike at the British colonies was to strike at the institution of slavery. And so for this group of enslaved West African men, planning their rebellion with the goal of getting to Florida was a way of capitalizing on European politics in North America. So they engage in this bloody rebellion, they kill a number of slaveholders. Interestingly, they make the decision to spare the slaveholders and merchants who were known to be kind to the enslaved people they own, but they had no qualms about fighting their revolution for freedom by striking out at the slaveholders who were known to be cruel and especially violent and exploitative. In the end, the Stono Rebellion is put down. South Carolina and Georgia militia finally succeed at killing and capturing most of the rebels. And in an act of real violence and demonstrating the threat and power of these slaveholding colonies, the rebels are beheaded and their heads are placed on pikes along the road from South Carolina to Florida as a warning to other enslaved men and women not to rebel, right? The decapitation would be the fate that awaited any future rebels. The Stono Rebellion is important because it allows us to see the presence of African culture and knowledge in the American colonies. It allows us to understand the ways in which African and then later generations of African American slaves were able to draw on African knowledge, but were also able to form bonds in America to create alliances and to strategize and resist with the intention of overthrowing slavery.